righty. Hello, everyone. I'll let everybody join us in our room. As you hop in to the link, please feel free to type in the chat where you're tuning in from today. We'd love to get some engagement because as you can see, you can see us, but we can't see you. So please feel free to greet each other in the chat. And this is also where you'll be able to ask questions for our speakers throughout the session. And so, I wanted to welcome each of you to our webinar today in partnership with the Educating All Learners Alliance, Data Quality Campaign, Zeta Charter Schools, and National Center for Learning Disabilities. And we're discussing, as you can see, data decisions and how assessments can affect students with disabilities. So we're excited to have a conversation today, and I'll just go ahead and jump right in. So just to give you a brief intro, my name's Gabrielle Oates. I'm representing ELA, which is the Educating All Learners Alliance. And so our goal with the Alliance was to ensure that special education services were provided at the start of the pandemic, and our work has continued on throughout and will continue afterwards. And so we have a curated resource library at our site, educatingalllearners.org. We share webinars such as this and podcast episodes, all to promote best practices for educators and families and students, of course, in the special education space. And so we are happy to bring together some of our partners today. And as a bit more of an intro, these are the founding partners of the Alliance, the 6 here that you'll see. And so they joined forces to create this partnership of now over 70 partner organizations. And some of our partners today you'll see are presenting. And so for our presenters today, I'm glad to have Julie Melke from Zeta Schools, Lindsay Kubatsky from NCLD, and Alexander Ball from DQC join us. And so they'll each touch on different points of that, data collection, both the practical lens and just the overarching policy lens. And we're excited to share with you today. As you possibly can see on your screen, we are recording today's session. And so this will be made available in addition to the slideshow you'll be able to reference afterwards and share with each other. But enough about me chatting on. I will go ahead and we'll jump right into the content, and I'll pass it over to Julie to take it away.
Thank you, Gabby. Again, I'm Julie Melke. I'm the Director of Special Populations for Zeta Charter Schools, and I am excited to talk to you today about how we are using data in a practical way to make decisions about reopening our schools. So I know that across the country, COVID has hit students hard, making it even more important that we are equipped with the right data points to proactively drive our decisions and instructional plans. So I know there's a lot of folks out there being innovative and sharing ideas. So my hope is that today I'm able to share even just 1 to 2 practical things that worked for us that you might want to consider, or that you might be thinking could work for you based on the needs of your schools. So I'm going to focus on 3 different areas and to really go into the ways that we have used data to think about our current plans and to think about our future plans as we continue our reopening process. So the 3 big buckets I'm going to touch on are, 1, the different learning model considerations. So I'll start by talking about what data we collected and how we used it to make decisions about which learning model is right for us. And then I will shift to talk about social and emotional support and how we've used data to target students and families who need support now, and how we plan to use it to prepare and tackle our fall reopening and the increased need for trauma-informed practices. And then lastly, I will touch on our response to intervention process. We have used a lot of our RTI data to drive our decisions now, and we are thinking already about how we can use the data that we're collecting in this moment to think about how we can more strategically support our students in the fall. So this slide here is that first bucket talking about learning model considerations. As is the case for most of you, when COVID first spiked and then we all realized it was here to stay, we considered many various models. We've been able to successfully change our school model 3 times this school year because we are constantly surveying our families and our teachers to understand the needs of our community. So before I keep going, if you all want to share, or if some folks want to share, what model are you currently using? Are you fully remote? Are you fully in person? Are you hybrid? I'd love to just understand sort of where folks currently stand. And then if helpful for you, I will go into sort of our thinking about the changes for the fall and how we can plan to continue our reopening process. So when we first started our journey to figure out which model was appropriate for us, we created a survey for parents to complete. And this survey allowed parents to sort of rank their preference for an in-person, virtual, or hybrid model. And then we created a space for parents to also indicate if they had a child with a disability, or if they were a frontline worker, or if they just needed to work, period. And then on the back end, we attached weights to all of those different responses so that we could really give preference to the families and students who needed in-person learning the most, based on their learning differences and needs, and those who needed to work outside the home. Simultaneously, we also surveyed all of our teachers. And this was really important to us so that we could identify which teachers were interested in in-person learning and to make sure that the desires of in-person teaching aligned with the needs of the families and students who wanted to be in person. So we did initially consider hybrid because we knew that we would have a lot of families who wanted to come in person, and we, based on our data, knew that we had a significant number of students with learning differences. So for that model, our plan was to have students with learning differences come 3 days a week, using that Wednesday to do small group intervention across the school for just students with learning differences. But when we did our survey, we saw that there was actually almost exactly the right amount of need from families as teachers, and we were able to offer a 5-day-a-week in-person structure, which obviously was even better. But I do think if ever we shift to a hybrid, our plan is to make sure that our students with learning differences come 3 days a week, while our typically developing students would come 2 days a week each. When we first opened in August, we had about 20% of our population in person. In October, we increased to about 45% of our students in person, and we currently have about 55% of our students in person. We have been able to make each of these changes because we are constantly collecting that data from our families and our teachers to understand the needs, and that has allowed us to sort of figure out what works best for our community. I'm going to now transition to talking about how we've used data to really drive our social and emotional support. So as you all well know, social and emotional support is needed now more than ever before, and for all students, not just students with learning differences, but also for our typically developing students. It is also a broad topic, so I'm going to share specifically about how we are using data to ensure that we are supporting students and families who are in need right now, as well as how we plan to use this data to prepare to tackle our fall reopening. So around April of last year, we started learning about students becoming sick, parents being hospitalized, family members of our students who were dying. We had families reach out who needed immediate support and access to food or shelter, and even had 3 families lose their homes entirely to fires. While we couldn't solve these crises for our families, we were lucky to be in a place where we could provide some support. And so even if that was sending a meal or providing groceries or providing families with access to grief support and resources. When it would early on, we did realize that the needs of our communities were great. And so One of the things that we did was start to track all of the concerns that our school staff were hearing about so that we could ensure that all families were receiving the appropriate support that they needed. How does this relate to data? It really required us to figure out how to effectively track all of the needs and the support. So we actually have a pretty extensive tracker that allows us to see the impact that COVID has had on our community overall. And then our school psychologists use sort of drop-down menus to quickly indicate what supports have been provided to each family. We also track all of our monetary and financial support that is being provided to families to ensure that our response is equitable and make sure that we are differentiating based on, so a family of 5 gets support that is proportional to a family of what a family of 3 might need or receive. We also understand that we have to work within a specific crisis budget, and so the more that we can track all of this, the better we can feel about what our current ability to support the needs of our communities is. And lastly, from a management perspective, our school leaders use this tracker to understand which families might be in need of mental health support and which families just might need more flexibility with regards to the school schedule or anything else that might be going on. Shifting to think about how we're going to use this data in the fall, I wanted to share a little bit about what we are planning. So we now have all of this data. Our teachers know these students well. They know which students are struggling the most. And we know that COVID has had an impact on, and the whole concept of remote learning has had a serious impact on students' abilities to socialize and consequently their abilities to learn. So we are anticipating that because some students have been out of school for 18 months, there are going to be challenges when they return, and there is going to be an increased need for trauma-informed practices. So now that we have all of this data, our plan is to use this information to identify the students who will need individualized plans. So that we can implement even before our school doors open. So for example, we know some students will benefit from meeting their teacher either over FaceTime or in person, seeing the school, seeing their classroom, and even seeing their own desk space. So whether that is in person or through a virtual function, we know that that's going to be a really important step for some students. We also know that some students will benefit from a visual schedule or just a preview of the schedule of the first day of school, so they know exactly what to expect. We plan to, for the students who need it, preview our COVID routines and our mindfulness routines so that students have an idea of what those sort of expectations are and some of the tools that they can use right away that first day of school. So using all of this data, we're going to have teachers think about each of the kids they currently teach and which students will need which type of plan, and they will create and then start to execute those plans 2 weeks out from the start of school. All right, the last topic I want to touch on today is response to intervention. So for us, I know that amidst the COVID-19 crisis, response to intervention became increasingly important, but also want to acknowledge that it's become even more challenging to implement. But with that said, we did lean into our RTI process really heavily. So I want to start with an overview of what our process looks like, and then talk about how we'll use this data to make decisions as we continue to make adjustments to our model and plan for the fall. So our process operates sort of loosely on a 4-week schedule. The first week is really looking at any new formal assessment data that we have. I think this speaks to what my colleagues are about to talk about, and that formal data will really allow us to identify the kids who are struggling. So we use formal data and we look at it every 4 weeks and we identify any kids who are really struggling. But we also look at the kids who've been receiving interventions and identify any kids who might be ready to graduate from those intervention supports. When a student is identified, in that moment, what we ask is that the RTI team really identify 1 to 2 specific skill deficits that they are going to focus on with that child in RTI. So for each skill, there is a specific set of data points that are going to be collected as progress monitoring every 2 to 4 weeks. So for example, if a student needs support with phonics, the teacher is provided with assessments that include letter sounds, letter names, letter blends, and sight words. The second week, the team meets with each teacher pair or each teacher individually, and they view the specific skill progress monitoring data and discuss all of the students in that class who are in RTI to make decisions and adjustments. The third week, we ensure that we are reviewing data and discussing instructional adjustments that might be needed for English language learners and our advanced students specifically. And then the fourth week, school staff meet as grade teams to review progress monitoring data and discuss student needs and interventions across the grade level. So we understand that teachers don't just teach the kids in their class, that there is a lot, especially with remote learning, there is a lot of opportunity for small groups to involve students who are not in a teacher's homeroom class. So we wanted to make sure that we create those opportunities for folks to discuss students across the grade. So as I mentioned earlier, we have changed our learning model 3 times this school year to best meet the needs of our students. And because we start from a high level with this formal data, we are able to see the growing needs of our student population in real time, and then consider those needs when we make changes. So the most applicable example of this is when we met, when we went fully remote in December. So we went fully remote and we looked at our RTI needs and realized that we needed a way to provide interventions on a much grander scale. And so as a result, we decided to pull some teachers out of classroom teaching roles and made them full-time intervention teachers who could pull skill-specific intervention groups throughout the day. That allowed us to deliver more effective support to the students who needed it the most. And we were able to see sort of some immediate positive results because of that change. Looking to the future, we know that some students who are struggling significantly with remote learning will have very real deficits when they return in the fall. So in June, we plan to use this exact same RTI data to identify students who would benefit from starting the year in RTI. Our hope is that we can use all of this information to effectively isolate the specific skills students will need to focus on, and we can proactively pair them with the right teachers and the right interventions so that right away, week 1, we can get students into doing interventions right away without any delay. So hopefully there was a lot in there, and I know that my colleagues are going to share a lot more on data on a more broad scale, but that is sort of the way that we've used data right now in a proactive sense. So I would love to hear if there's anything that was helpful for you, throw it in the chat, or if you want to just share something that is top of mind, I'd love to just hear from folks what your current focus is and what things have looked like for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. I think that was, oh, do you have one more slide?
Looks like it just got swapped around.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks, Julie. And I think that was really incredible, the type of flexibility that your school has been doing. And I think building off what you just talked about, I wanted to talk a little bit about formative assessments and the differences between those and statewide assessments and where we can use the data between those to support students with disabilities. So again, I'm Lindsay Kabatsky with the National Center for Learning Disabilities. And I just wanted to say that formative assessments are really important for schools to be using right now. Typically, these types of assessments are used to provide educators with an idea of where students are in their learning. These quick assessments can identify where a student might have a barrier to learning, and then changes can be made in real time. In our current situation where schools are trying to figure out where schools are, these quick tests can be super helpful for educators. However, they don't give a holistic view of how schools and districts are serving students, in particular student groups particular groups of students. So that's where statewide assessments come into play. This gives us a fuller picture of the situation at a systems level. We have to remember that while these tests are not very popular with parents, teachers, or students for a number of reasons, the data they produce does provide a unique purpose. They're particularly important for students with disabilities because statewide assessments are one of the only measures of progress that parents of students with disabilities can have that shows how their child is doing compared to their grade level peers. Not only are formative and local assessments sometimes not aligned to grade level standards, they sometimes don't have accommodations set up for students with disabilities to really showcase where they might be in their learning trajectory. The purpose of these tests are completely different from formative assessments. They give us a snapshot of the whole system at one time and then provide decision makers and policymakers and advocates and the public at large a perspective on how well schools are providing opportunities for students to progress. They let us see achievement and opportunity gaps between groups of students and identify trends or areas of need. Not only that, they come with money. Because of how the federal law is structured, resources are sent to schools where tests are showing that students are not being served equitably. This is especially important for students with disabilities because schools are often targeted because of the performance of this subgroup compared to their peers. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the inclusion of students with disabilities on these statewide assessments. So it wasn't too long ago where students with disabilities were entirely excluded from not only state assessments, but the education system as a whole. Prior to 1975, there were state laws that prohibited students with disabilities from even attending schools. So they remained invisible to the education system. Then going all the way, so then the passage of IDEA allowed students with disabilities to participate in public schools and be included. But not until No Child Left Behind in 2001 were students with disabilities included in statewide assessment systems. So oftentimes prior to NCLD, students with disabilities were put on buses and sent to a field trip or specifically asked to stay home so that they weren't participating in the school level data on how well they were performing compared to their peers. So when NCLB passed in 2001, it required students with disabilities to be tested in the same way as their peers. Fast forward to 2015, the federal law maintains that requirement, and 99% of students with disabilities take the exact same statewide assessment as their peers. 1% of students with disabilities, the students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, they take an alternate assessment that is aligned to their unique needs and where they are in their learning. So over the past 2 decades, we argue that this transparency and data collection incentivized schools to measure progress on students with disabilities and incentivized increased inclusion rates for students with disabilities. We now see that students with, specifically students with learning disabilities, 70% of them spend most of their time in general education courses. We know that they can achieve at the same level as their peers if given the right supports and accommodations. So while there's a lot of work to do to continue to support these students, collecting data is essential to keeping us on the trajectory of inclusion and positive systemic change. So transparency is one of the greatest tools for advocates, family, and educators to have to get more resources in place to the students that need them the most. So what about during the pandemic? How do we use data and what value does it have? So right now it can be hard to see the value in these state assessment systems. We know kids are struggling. We know many of them will be behind grade level due to lost instruction. But if we think ahead to the future, we can't really measure progress of our system in recouping the lost instruction and helping kids catch up if we don't measure their baseline, if we don't have baseline measures or at least some data showing how they're doing during the hardest part of the pandemic. And since the pandemic began, we've lost a lot of critical data that we've relied on historically. Statewide assessments were waived last year, as many of you know. The NAEP assessment, one of the few sort of nationally administered assessment system. It's a sample of public school students was postponed, and the civil rights data collection was postponed. And that was a tool that many civil rights organizations and advocates used to try to get services and supports to students who might need it the most. So we know data is power, and without that, the systems level of data, we aren't able to respond to the needs of our students and schools. Recently, last month, the Department of Education announced that they're waiving all accountability requirements this year. This means that while states need to administer the assessments and report out on what the data shows, there won't be any consequences tied to the results of those assessments. So they're removing any sort of high stakes that have historically been associated with the assessment system. In other words, the Department of Ed just wants to know what the data shows. They're not trying to, target, identify schools for low performance or anything like that. They just want to see where students are. And to help understand the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on our students, they recommended that states continue to try to assess as many students as possible. But they also said states and districts could do things such as shorten the test, administer it remotely, or administer it at different times, including during the summer or even at the start of the next school year. So the flexibility available this year, the department recognizes that the value of this data holds in helping us address the scope of the issues that we're seeing. And it's also important to recognize that statewide assessment data is not the end-all be-all of what's being collected. Just as we talked about the value of formative assessment data, there are other kinds of data that schools should plan to gather to help us support students with disability. This data can be especially helpful for families and advocates and decision makers to help target resources to support these students. This includes understanding how much of the learning took place in synchronous or asynchronous environments. We just heard from Julie how different schools, like one school can educate students and how differently that changed throughout the school year. We would also like to know what services and supports were provided to students with disabilities and English learners. We know that these students need additional accommodations to access content and curriculum. And so we as advocates would like to know what was provided to these students. And finally, we'd like to know, given the influx of money from the COVID relief packages recently passed by Congress, how districts and state plans to use these resources in a way that's equitable and promotes opportunities for different groups of students who have historically been disadvantaged. So we have a lot of work to do to support students with disabilities during this incredibly difficult time. And one way we can be more strategic and thoughtful is to understand which students need the most help. Without the data, we run the risk of exacerbating opportunity gaps, not fulfilling our promise of providing an equitable and inclusive education to all students. It will take all kinds of data to make a difference, and our next presenter will share more about how the data can be used and shared effectively. Like Julie, I'm happy to engage with all of you at the end of the presentations, and I'd like to answer any questions either on this chat or via email. So feel free to stay connected with NCLD on our social media handles or emailing me directly. So I'll now turn it over to my partners at DQC.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. As you said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about why assessments in general and specifically statewide assessments matter to parents and families in addition to school leaders and educators. As Lindsay mentioned, my name is Alexandra Ball. I'm a senior research and policy associate at the Data Quality Campaign. We're a nonprofit advocacy organization that focuses on using data effectively to support students. Data encompasses much more than just assessments, but the COVID-19 crisis has forced us to look specifically at the role of assessments, and even more specifically, statewide assessments, and their importance for family, educators, and system leaders. We've heard about the data and assessments at the school and district level, and so now I'd like to focus in on why assessments can matter for parents and families as they work to support their students. Oh, and my introduction slide. So right off the bat, parents and families need data to support student learning and ensure that needs are met. This is always true, but it has taken on new significance in the past year. School closures have forced parents to take on new roles as tutors and teachers at home, yet many were still in the dark on how their student was doing academically. And assessments are one piece of the larger constellation of data that parents need to support their students. Last year, statewide assessments were canceled due to school closures. However, as Lindsay said, the Department of Education has made it clear that states are still required to test all students to the best of their ability this year. Statewide assessments are uniquely valuable because they show where every student stands in relation to their peers and to state standards. They're the only measure of student performance that we have that can be compared across districts statewide. And assessment data is particularly useful to parents when it is comparable, meaning it allows them to be compared to their peers, when it's timely, meaning that they get the results immediately or very quickly rather than waiting for weeks or months, and when it is actionable, meaning it is presented with concrete steps and resources that parents and families can use to address and students' needs. And this year in particular, it's important to look at assessment data in the context of students' opportunities to learn, or OTL. OTL data captures things like instruction, supports, resources, other things that students have received over the past year. Examples might include internet access, the type of remote instruction they were receiving, when they returned to the classroom, and what model their school used, things like that. And at DQC, we're advocating for states to have a data point on each and every student, either a result from a statewide assessment or information on why the student did or could not participate in that assessment. With access to both types of these data, parents and family can better understand what their student has experienced over the past year, where they stand now, and what all they need to do to get back on track to succeed. In the rest of my time today, I wanted to highlight a few key ways that assessments provide value to parents and families and can support them in supporting their own students. So the first way is helping them understand student progress. So the way assessment allows parents and families to do this is through growth measures. Growth measures are metrics that use multiple years of performance data from statewide assessments to capture student progress over time. This information paints a more comprehensive picture of student learning than point-in-time results alone. Growth data is valuable to parents and student families in a number of ways. It can capture student learning above and beyond benchmarks, which is particularly important for students who may not meet proficiency levels but are still improving. Moreover, growth measures show how individual educators are helping their students grow and can shine light on teachers and schools that are going above and beyond to support their students. For these reasons, growth measures are widely seen as the most equitable measure of student performance. This year, we don't have prior data from statewide assessments because 2020 tests were canceled. Typically, this is the information we use to measure student growth. However, state leaders can still measure student growth this year using an approach known as skip year growth. This means they use assessment data from statewide assessments this year in 2021 and measure growth from statewide assessments in 2019 over the course of 2 years. This is a tried and tested solution and can produce valid and reliable growth data. Multiple states, including Florida and Ohio, have already committed to measuring student growth this year. With access to this information, parents and families will be able to see the impact of the past year on their students' learning trajectory. This information will be critical as they continue to support their students over the summer and heading into next year. The next way that assessments can provide value to parents and families is by helping them act as partners in learning. Assessment data is one type of information that schools and districts can and should be sharing through their parent portals. These are online platforms that allow parents to view information on their students' academic history and performance, their day-to-day activities, and other relevant metrics. Every district has the ability to turn on parent access to their student information systems, and so can provide these portals for parents. In addition to providing parents with data such as assessment scores, parent portals are also important tools for sharing resources and engaging in one-to-one communication with parents. It allows them to stay up to date on how their children are doing and to see their students' performance in the context of what's happening in their classroom and provide needed supports. And parent portals are not just a neat gadget. Our 2020 survey results show that parents actually want and need access to student data. Less than half of parents surveyed said they had the access to the data they needed to support their students. However, 8 in 10 already had access to some sort of online platform or portal. By building out these portals with the data that is relevant to their students' progress, such as assessment results and growth data, along with helpful resources and supports, schools can give parents the tools they need to provide 360-degree support. And this is particularly important for parents of students with disabilities, who tend to be more data savvy and use data more regularly to make sure that their students' unique needs are being met. Finally, the last way I wanted to highlight that assessments are valuable to parents and families is because they provide the information that parents need to advocate for equity and transparency from their schools and districts. A key way this happens is through state report cards. Under the Every Student Succeeds Act, as Lindsay mentioned, states and districts are required to publish an annual report card with data on student performance, growth, outcomes, as well as school climate and resources. Much of this information is required to be broken down by student group or disaggregated. This makes report cards a critical tool for seeing how well students are serving different groups of, or schools are serving different groups of students, and for highlighting equity gaps. This past year, state report cards are missing many key data elements, such as assessment results and school grades, due to school closures. However, in 2021, states must release updated report cards complete with results from 2021 assessments broken down by student group. Putting this information into the hands of parents and families will give them the tools that they need to ensure their students are getting the supports they need and to advocate for change where they are not. Moreover, they're important tools for building trust with the community and for maintaining transparency moving forward. In conclusion, I just wanted to reiterate that assessments are not the only piece of data that matters this year, but they're an important part of the puzzle. And it is imperative that states and districts work with schools and community members to ensure that as many students as possible can safely participate in assessments. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I've included my email here. And if you haven't already, please check out the DQC website and Twitter. We've been closely tracking the evolving conversation on assessments and data needs in the COVID-19 era and are regularly sharing updates and resources. Thank you. With that, I can turn it back over to Gabby.
So much. Thank you again to each of our presenters. I know that there's a lot of questions around accessing this information, so I wanted to quickly address that, and then we do have some time left for a Q&A. So again, as I go through, feel free to write in any remaining questions that you may or may not have. And so I guess one question is, I think in reference to your portion, Allie, was about that skip year growth information. Is that just accessible on DQC's site, or is there a particular place?
Yes, we actually, last summer, as it so happens, we published a whole brief on what skip year growth is, how it can be used and measured, and why it matters, which I can put the link to in the chat. But I think that is the best place to look for information on what exactly this is. Especially because we're learning that some states are indeed going to measure skip year growth and incorporate that in their data systems for 2021 assessments.
Yeah, it's definitely a useful piece of information and some that many may not have realized before. I'm sure the students might like having 1 year of no testing. So it's helpful that their information can still be, used for the benefit of them.
Definitely.
Awesome. And I just wanted to, I don't think there were any remaining questions. I know we kind of covered a lot, so hopefully that was helpful for you all. But I just wanted to remind you to check out each of our presenters' websites and information. And I also wanted to, I'll just advance here, you can see information about the Educating All Learners Alliance. We have various communities, various Facebook groups that we facilitate. We have a member community, and we continue to accept and vet resources as well as create resources for our library. So all that can be found at educatingalllearners.org. And again, our partners were NCLD, Zeta Schools, and DQC, the Data Quality Campaign. So you can check out each of their information for more. And I do see that Allie added that link that she mentioned on Skip Your Growth in the chat, and I'll make sure that that is linked below in the description of this recording. All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so feel free to follow up with the presenters with any more. Thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.